Teen smiles in court, thinking, she'll go free. Then the shocking video changes everything. 15-year-old Carly Madison. Greg stood in the courtroom with an expression that unsettled everyone who saw it. There was no trembling, no tears, just an unnerving calmness that seemed impossible for someone her age facing what she was facing. Her defense team spoke of mental illness, of voices she couldn't control, of a mind that had fractured beyond her understanding. But then the prosecution played a recording, a 911 call, clear, deliberate, cold. In that moment, the carefully constructed story began to collapse. This wasn't a child who had lost control. This was a teenager who had made choices that would haunt a courtroom, a family, and an entire community. She thought her age might save her. She thought the narrative of innocence would hold. But one piece of evidence was about to change everything. Stories like this remind us that justice doesn't bend for age or excuses. If you believe accountability matters, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. This case will challenge everything you think you know about youth and consequence. This is how it all began. Brandon, Mississippi, March 19, 2024. A quiet neighborhood where families knew each other by name, where children rode bikes until streetlights came on, where nothing ever really happened until it did. Carly Gregg was 14 years old, an honor student. Teachers described her as bright, engaged, always raising her hand with thoughtful questions. Her mother, Ashley Smiley, was a math teacher beloved by her students, warm, patient, devoted to her daughter in ways that went beyond obligation. Her stepfather, Heath Smiley, had come into their lives with genuine care, building what seemed like a stable home. From the outside, they looked like any other family. But inside that house, something had begun to shift. Something quiet, something invisible, something that would explode into a tragedy no one saw coming. Carly Madison. Gregg wasn't always the girl who would stand trial for unthinkable acts. She was once just a child navigating the ordinary complexities of adolescence. Her early years in Brandon were marked by academic success and social ease. She made friends quickly, participated in school activities, and earned praise from nearly every adult who encountered her. Her wit was sharp but never cruel. Her manners were impeccable. She seemed destined for college scholarships and a future that stretched wide with possibility. But beneath that polished surface, something else was growing. Something her mother would only recognize in hindsight, when it was far too late to intervene. Ashley Smiley had raised Carly largely on her own before Heath entered their lives. She worked long hours as a math teacher, pouring herself into both her students and her daughter with equal intensity. Ashley was the kind of mother who attended every school event, who checked homework with patience, who stayed up late talking through teenage anxieties. She wanted Carly to feel secure, loved, capable of anything. But Ashley also carried her own struggles, the weight of single parenthood, the financial pressures, the exhaustion that came from being everything to everyone. Carly absorbed these tensions even when Ashley tried to hide them. She began to feel responsible for her mother's happiness, a burden no child should carry. Carly's biological father, Kevin Gregg, remained a complicated presence in her life. He battled schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, conditions that had fractured his ability to maintain stability. Substance abuse compounded his challenges, creating a pattern of absence and unpredictability. Carly saw him occasionally, but those visits were fraught with confusion and disappointment. She inherited more than just his last name. She inherited a genetic vulnerability, a predisposition toward mental illness that would become impossible to ignore. Kevin's struggles cast a long shadow, one that reached into Carly's own mind as she moved through her teenage years. The question would later become whether biology excused behavior or whether choice still mattered when the mind itself was compromised. When Heath Smiley married Ashley, Carly seemed to welcome the change. Heath was steady, kind, genuinely interested in building a relationship with his stepdaughter. He attended her school functions, helped with projects, tried to create moments of normalcy. For a while it worked. The household felt complete in a way it hadn't before. But as Carly entered her early teens, subtle shifts began to appear. She withdrew into her room more often. Her sleep patterns became erratic, with nights spent awake and days spent exhausted. Her grades remained strong, but the effort required seemed to drain her in ways that hadn't been visible before. Ashley noticed but attributed it to typical teenage moodiness. Heath noticed but hesitated to push too hard, worried about overstepping as a stepfather. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Heath found evidence of self-harm. Cuts on Carly's arms, hidden beneath long sleeves and careful excuses. The revelation shattered the illusion of normalcy. Ashley immediately sought help, scheduling therapy appointments and consulting doctors. Carly was prescribed Zoloft, an antidepressant meant to stabilize her mood and ease the anxiety that seemed to be consuming her from within. The medication helped initially, but the underlying issues remained. Carly spoke of feeling disconnected from herself, of watching her own life from a distance. She described intrusive thoughts that felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. Her therapist documented these symptoms, noting possible signs of dissociation and early psychosis. But Carly was also hiding more than her mental health struggles. She had acquired burner phones, devices her parents knew nothing about. She was using marijuana regularly, connecting with people outside her usual social circle. She was engaging in relationships and activities that existed in complete secrecy from Ashley and Heath. This double life created a fracture between who Carly appeared to be and who she was becoming. Her friends noticed the changes but dismissed them as typical rebellion. Her parents saw warning signs but couldn't access the full picture. Carly had learned to compartmentalize, to present different versions of herself depending on who was watching. It was a skill that would become chillingly relevant when investigators later pieced together the timeline of her actions. Just days before March 19th, Carly's psychiatrist made a decision that would haunt everyone involved. The Zoloft wasn't providing adequate relief, so the prescription was switched to Lexapro. Medication changes in adolescence carry risks, particularly for those already experiencing symptoms of psychosis. The transition period can destabilize mood, increase anxiety, and in rare cases trigger episodes of altered perception. Carly's journal entries from those final days reveal a mind in crisis. She wrote about hearing voices that commanded her to do things she didn't want to do. She described feeling as though she wasn't real, as though her body was moving without her conscious control. These entries would later become central evidence in her trial, examined by experts from both sides who drew vastly different conclusions about what they meant for her culpability. The morning of March 19th began like any other. Ashley woke early, prepared for her teaching day, kissed Carly goodbye as she headed to school. Heath left for work shortly after, his mind already on the tasks waiting at his job. Carly attended her classes, turned in assignments, spoke with friends in the hallways. Nothing about her behavior that day signaled what was coming. She returned home in the early afternoon, the house empty and quiet. Security cameras captured her entering through the front door, dropping her backpack, moving through familiar rooms with no apparent urgency. For anyone watching that footage later, the normalcy would be the most disturbing part. There was no frenzy, no visible breakdown, no moment where everything clearly went wrong. There was only a teenage girl alone in her house, about to make a choice that would destroy multiple lives forever. The security cameras installed throughout the Smiley home were meant to provide peace of mind. They were Ashley's idea, a way to monitor comings and goings to ensure Carly was safe when home alone. The footage was stored digitally, accessible from Ashley's phone whenever she wanted to check in. Neither Ashley nor Heath imagined these cameras would one day document the most horrific moments of their lives. But technology doesn't discriminate between mundane daily routines and unthinkable tragedies. It simply records. And on March 19th, those cameras captured everything with clinical precision. Every movement, every decision, every moment that would later be analyzed frame by frame in a courtroom where Carly's fate would be decided. Carly moved through the house with purpose after arriving home. The footage shows her pausing in the kitchen, standing still for several seconds as if considering something. Then she walked toward the master bedroom, the space her mother and Heath shared. She knew exactly where Ashley kept the .357 Magnum. It was under the mattress on Ashley's side of the bed, a location Carly had obviously discovered at some earlier point. The gun was there for protection, a precaution Ashley felt necessary as a woman living with a teenage daughter. She never imagined the weapon might be used against her. Carly retrieved it without hesitation, without fumbling, without any sign of confusion or disorientation. Her hands were steady, her movements were deliberate. This wasn't someone in the grip of a psychotic break who had lost touch with reality. Ashley arrived home around 3:30 that afternoon. The cameras captured her walking through the front door, setting down her teaching materials, calling out for Carly. Mother and daughter interacted briefly in the hallway. Ashley smiled, asked about Carly's day, mentioned something about dinner plans. Carly responded with words the cameras couldn't capture, but with body language that appeared normal. There was no visible tension, no argument, no confrontation that escalated into violence. Ashley moved toward her bedroom to change out of her work clothes, the mundane ritual of a woman transitioning from teacher to mother. She had no reason to feel afraid, no reason to suspect that her daughter was armed, no reason to believe these would be the final moments of her life. What happened next inside that bedroom would be reconstructed through forensic evidence and the security footage that captured audio even when the visual angles were limited. Multiple gunshots echoed through the house. Ashley was struck in the shoulder first, the impact spinning her body. A second shot hit her neck, severing critical arteries. A third shot struck her face, the most devastating of the wounds. Ashley collapsed, her life ending rapidly from blood loss and trauma. The forensic pathologist would later testify that death occurred within minutes, possibly faster. There was no prolonged suffering, though that small mercy did little to comfort those who loved her. Carly stood over her mother's body, the gun still in her hand, the room now transformed into a crime scene that would be photographed and analyzed in excruciating detail. But Carly didn't flee, she didn't panic, she didn't call for help. Instead, she engaged in a series of actions that prosecutors would later argue demonstrated clear consciousness of guilt and calculated planning. She repositioned Ashley's body, moving it partially to obscure some of the wounds. She placed a towel over Ashley's face, covering the most graphic injury. She wiped surfaces, though not thoroughly enough to eliminate all forensic evidence. Then, she picked up Ashley's phone. She sent a text message to Heath, impersonating her mother. The message was casual, asking Heath to come home early, mentioning something she needed his help with. The tone was so normal, so perfectly mimicking Ashley's texting style, that Heath never suspected anything was wrong. He replied that he'd be there soon, completely unaware that his wife was already gone. Carly then did something that would baffle investigators and later become a focal point of psychological analysis. She contacted friends, not to confess, but to chat casually. as if nothing had happened. One friend would later testify that Carly seemed completely normal during their conversation, discussing weekend plans and school gossip. When this friend mentioned calling Carly's parents to coordinate something, Carly quickly discouraged it, saying her mom was resting and shouldn't be disturbed. The friend thought nothing of it at the time. Only later, when the truth emerged, would that conversation take on a sinister quality. How could someone who had just taken her mother's life engage in such ordinary dialogue? The question would hang over the entire trial, challenging everyone's understanding of mental illness, dissociation, and criminal responsibility. Heath arrived home around 4:15. He parked in the driveway, gathered his things, walked toward the front door expecting a normal evening. The security cameras captured him entering, calling out for Ashley. Carly appeared in the hallway, the gun now concealed behind her back. Heath smiled at his stepdaughter, asked if she'd seen her mom. Carly pointed toward the back of the house, suggesting Ashley might be in the bedroom. As Heath turned to walk in that direction, Carly raised the weapon. She fired multiple times. Heath felt the impact of bullets entering his body, the searing pain that accompanied each wound. But survival instinct overrode shock. He lunged toward Carly, managing to knock the gun from her hand despite his injuries. They struggled briefly before Carly broke free and ran. Heath collapsed in the hallway, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds, but conscious enough to realize what had happened. He managed to reach his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. His voice on that call would later be played in court, the raw terror and disbelief evident in every word. He told the dispatcher that Carly had shot him, that Ashley might be hurt too, though he hadn't been able to reach the bedroom, that Carly had fled the house. Emergency services were dispatched immediately, arriving within minutes to a scene of chaos and violence. Heath was rushed to surgery, his injuries serious but not fatal. Ashley was pronounced deceased at the scene, and Carly was somewhere in the neighborhood running from the consequences of what she'd done, her future already irreversibly changed. Carly ran through backyards with the desperation of someone who finally understood that everything had changed. She vaulted over fences, stumbled through gardens, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Neighbors who happened to be outside saw a teenage girl sprinting past, her expression wild, her movements frantic. Some recognized her from the neighborhood, others simply watched in confusion as she disappeared between houses. A friend who had been texting with Carly realized something was terribly wrong and began searching for her, calling her name, trying to understand what was happening. This friend would later testify about finding Carly several streets away, hiding behind a vehicle, her entire body trembling. When asked what happened, Carly said nothing coherent. She just kept asking if Heath was okay, if someone had called for help. Law enforcement arrived in force. Multiple patrol units flooded the quiet Brandon neighborhood, officers spreading out to locate the suspect described in the 911 call, a teenage girl, armed and dangerous, possibly experiencing a mental health crisis. The officers approached the situation with caution, aware that confronting someone in Carly's state could escalate into further violence. They found her within 20 minutes, crouched behind a car 3 blocks from her home. She didn't resist arrest. Her hands were empty, the weapon left behind in the house during her struggle with Heath. She looked up at the officers with eyes that seemed both terrified and distant, as if she couldn't quite process where she was or how she'd gotten there. They handcuffed her gently, reading her rights in voices that tried to balance authority with awareness of her age. The crime scene investigation began immediately. The Smiley home was cordoned off with yellow tape, transformed from a family residence into evidence. Forensic technicians photographed every room, every surface, every trace of what had occurred. They collected the .357 Magnum, documenting its location and condition. They examined Ashley's body where it lay, taking measurements and samples before transport. They reviewed the security camera footage, downloading files that would become the prosecution's most powerful evidence. Blood spatter analysts studied the patterns on walls and floors, reconstructing the sequence of shots. Shell casings were collected and logged. Fingerprints were lifted from doorknobs, light switches, the gun itself. Every piece of physical evidence supported the same conclusion. This was not a random act of violence born from sudden psychosis. This was deliberate. The timeline established by investigators left little room for ambiguity. Carly had returned home from school with enough time to plan her actions. She had retrieved the gun without any signs of confusion or hesitation. She had waited for her mother to arrive, interacted normally, then followed her into the bedroom. After the shooting, she had taken specific steps to manipulate the scene and lure Heath home. The text message sent from Ashley's phone was particularly damning. Prosecutors would later argue that this single action demonstrated awareness of wrongdoing and intent to harm Heath as well. Someone in the grip of a true psychotic break, they contended, wouldn't have the presence of mind to craft a deceptive message. Carly's defense team would counter that dissociation can coexist with seemingly rational behavior, but the evidence made their task enormously difficult. Carly was transported to a juvenile detention facility, placed in a cell designed for minors awaiting trial. She was evaluated by medical staff, checked for injuries, asked basic questions about her mental state. She responded in monosyllables, her affect flat, her gaze unfocused. A psychiatrist was called to assess whether she posed a danger to herself. The evaluation noted symptoms consistent with trauma and possible dissociation, but also observed that Carly seemed oriented to time and place. She knew where she was. She knew what day it was. She knew why she'd been arrested. These observations would later complicate the defense narrative of a complete psychotic break. If Carly understood the reality of her situation in the hours after the crime, how complete could her detachment from reality have been during the crime itself? The community of Brandon reeled from the news. Parents who knew Ashley from parent-teacher conferences struggled to process her death. Students who had been in her math classes organized vigils, lighting candles, and sharing memories of a teacher who had made learning feel accessible and even joyful. Heath's colleagues started fundraisers to help with medical expenses, his recovery complicated by both physical injuries and psychological trauma. And everyone asked the same questions. How could a 14-year-old honor student commit such violence? What warning signs had been missed? Could anything have prevented this tragedy? The answers were elusive, buried in the complex intersection of mental illness, adolescent brain development, family dynamics, and individual choice. Carly's arrest photo circulated online, sparking immediate debate. Some looked at her young face and saw a child who needed help, not punishment. Others saw a calculated offender who deserved the harshest possible consequences. The image became a Rorschach test, revealing more about the viewer's beliefs about justice, mental health, and accountability than about Carly herself. Comment sections filled with arguments. Should teenagers ever be tried as adults? Does mental illness excuse violence? What about the victims and their right to justice? The case became a lightning rod for larger societal questions that had no easy answers. And at the center of it all was a 15-year-old girl sitting in a detention cell, facing charges that could keep her imprisoned for life. The forensic psychologist assigned to evaluate Carly spent hours conducting interviews and reviewing her history. Medical records documented years of mental health struggles. School records showed academic excellence alongside behavioral concerns. Text messages and social media revealed a secret life her parents hadn't fully known. Journal entries described auditory hallucinations and feelings of unreality. The psychologist's report would become a critical document analyzed by both prosecution and defense. It acknowledged genuine mental illness while also noting preserved executive function and awareness of consequences. Carly had been suffering, the report concluded, but suffering alone doesn't constitute legal insanity. The question wasn't whether Carly had been mentally ill. The question was whether that illness had completely eliminated her ability to distinguish right from wrong, to control her actions, to understand the nature of what she was doing. And on that question, the evidence painted a complicated picture. As days turned into weeks, the legal machinery began its inexorable process. Prosecutors reviewed evidence and made charging decisions. Defense attorneys were appointed and began building their case. Victim advocates worked with Heath and Ashley's extended family, helping them navigate the trauma. And Carly remained in detention, her childhood effectively over, her future dependent on decisions made by attorneys, judges, and eventually a jury of 12 strangers who would be asked to decide not just her guilt, but the meaning of accountability itself. The decision to charge Carly as an adult came after extensive deliberation among prosecutors. Mississippi law provided pathways for transferring juvenile offenders to adult court, particularly in cases involving serious, violent crimes. The severity of the charges, first-degree murder, attempted murder, and tampering with evidence, met the threshold for such transfer. But the decision carried enormous weight. Juvenile court offered possibilities for rehabilitation, treatment, and eventual reintegration into society. Adult court meant decades in prison, possibly life without parole. Prosecutors understood the gravity of what they were proposing. They also believed the evidence demanded it. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or an accident gone wrong. This was intentional violence against two people, one of whom died and one of whom barely survived. The first-degree murder charge required proving premeditation. Prosecutors argued that Carly's actions before, during, and after the shooting demonstrated deliberate planning. She knew where the gun was located. She retrieved it while alone in the house. She waited for her mother to arrive home. She followed Ashley into the bedroom and fired multiple times, suggesting intent to kill rather than merely injure. The text message to Heath showed forethought and deception. Each element built a case that this was calculated violence, not impulsive rage. The attempted murder charge focused on the attack against Heath, arguing that Carly's ambush demonstrated clear intent to take his life as well. The tampering charge related to her manipulation of the security cameras and crime scene, actions that showed consciousness of guilt. Carly's defense team faced a monumental challenge. Their client was 14 years old when the crime occurred, 15 by the time the trial approached. She had documented mental health issues spanning years. She came from a family with significant genetic predisposition to severe mental illness. She had been experiencing symptoms consistent with psychosis in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Her medication had been changed just days before, during a vulnerable transition period. All of these factors painted a picture of a deeply troubled child whose actions resulted from illness rather than evil intent. But the defense also had to contend with the security footage, the witness testimony, and the calculated nature of certain actions. Their strategy became clear. Argue that mental illness can coexist with seemingly rational behavior, that dissociation creates a state where someone can go through motions without true conscious control. The plea negotiations began months before trial. Prosecutors offered a 40-year sentence in exchange for guilty pleas on all charges. For an adult offender, 40 years might seem harsh. For a 14-year-old, it meant spending virtually her entire adult life behind bars. The offer would make Carly eligible for release in her 50s, assuming good behavior and parole approval. Her attorneys presented the offer explaining the certainty it provided versus the risk of trial. If convicted by a jury in adult court, Carly faced mandatory life without parole for first-degree murder. There would be no possibility of ever walking free. The choice was stark: accept 4 decades of imprisonment with eventual freedom, or risk dying in prison. Carly, barely into her teenage years, was asked to make a decision that would define the rest of her existence. She rejected the plea. Her attorneys were surprised, but respected her decision. Carly maintained that she hadn't been in control of her actions, that voices had commanded her, that she felt like a passenger in her own body during the shooting. She believed, or desperately wanted to believe, that a jury would understand, that they would see her as a sick child rather than a criminal, that mental illness would provide not just an explanation, but an excuse. Her defense team prepared for trial knowing the odds were against them, but also knowing that their client deserved a vigorous defense regardless of public opinion or the strength of the prosecution's case. They began assembling expert witnesses, psychiatric evaluations, and testimony designed to humanize Carly and contextualize her actions within the framework of severe mental illness. The prosecution assembled their own expert witnesses, professionals who would testify that mental illness and legal insanity are distinct concepts. Someone can suffer from depression, anxiety, even psychotic symptoms, while still retaining the capacity to understand right from wrong and to control their behavior. The legal standard for insanity is extraordinarily high, designed to capture only the most severe cases where cognitive function is completely compromised. Prosecutors would argue that Carly's actions demonstrated preserved judgment, planning ability, and awareness of consequences. The security footage would be their most powerful exhibit, showing deliberate movements rather than chaotic confusion. The text message would demonstrate calculated deception. Heath's testimony would provide emotional weight, reminding the jury of real human costs. Jury selection became its own complicated process. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their views on mental illness, juvenile justice, and the death penalty. Although Mississippi law prohibited executing anyone who committed their crime as a juvenile, the question of ultimate punishment still mattered. Could jurors sentence a teenager to life without parole? Did they believe children could be held to the same standard of accountability as adults? Did they have biases about mental health that would prevent them from fairly evaluating psychiatric testimony? The attorneys on both sides exercised challenges, dismissing jurors whose responses suggested they couldn't be impartial. The final 12 selected represented a cross-section of the community, people asked to render judgment on questions that philosophers and ethicists had debated for centuries. The trial date was set for early the following year, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Carly remained in juvenile detention throughout this period, her days marked by routine and isolation. She attended classes designed for detained youth, though her ability to concentrate was limited. She met with her attorneys regularly, reviewing evidence and preparing for potential testimony. She wrote letters to family members who still maintained contact, expressing remorse but also confusion about her own memories of that day. Some of these letters would later be introduced as evidence, analyzed for what they revealed about her mental state and understanding of her actions. Every word she wrote became potential ammunition for one side or the other. Heath Smiley faced his own agonizing decisions. As the surviving victim and Carly's stepfather, he occupied an impossible position. Part of him wanted justice for Ashley, wanted Carly held accountable for destroying their family. Another part remembered the little girl he'd helped raise, the child who had once trusted him, who had once seemed capable of a normal future. He attended victim support groups, speaking with others who had lost loved ones to violence. He underwent physical therapy for his gunshot wounds, the scars a permanent reminder of that terrible afternoon. And he prepared himself to testify, knowing that facing Carly in court would require reliving the worst moments of his life in front of strangers, cameras, and the person who had caused all this pain. The trial began on a cold January morning. The courthouse filled early with journalists, victim advocates, mental health professionals, and members of the public who had followed the case obsessively. Security was heightened, metal detectors processing everyone who entered. Camera crews positioned themselves outside, restricted from filming inside the courtroom, but ready to capture any arrivals or departures. Carly was transported from detention in a vehicle with tinted windows, her wrists and ankles shackled according to protocol. When she entered the courtroom, those restraints were removed so the jury wouldn't see her bound. She wore clothing selected by her defense team to emphasize her youth, simple, modest, the kind of outfit any teenager might wear to church. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She looked small sitting at the defense table, flanked by attorneys who towered over her. The prosecution's opening statement set the tone immediately. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury and spoke with controlled intensity. This case, he explained, was about choices made by a teenager who knew exactly what she was doing. He walked them through the timeline, describing how Carly retrieved the gun, waited for her mother, fired multiple shots, then manipulated evidence and lured her stepfather into an ambush. He acknowledged that Carly had struggled with mental health issues, but emphasized that struggling doesn't equal incapacity. Millions of teenagers deal with depression and anxiety without harming anyone. The prosecutor's voice rose slightly as he described Ashley Smiley, a devoted teacher and mother who died in her own bedroom at the hands of her daughter. He described Heath's near-death experience, the physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. And he promised that the evidence would prove beyond reasonable doubt that Carly was guilty of every charge. The defense's opening statement took a dramatically different approach. Carly's lead attorney spoke softly, asking the jury to remember what it felt like to be 14 years old, to remember the confusion, the emotional volatility, the sense that everything happening in the moment felt overwhelming and permanent. Then she asked them to imagine experiencing all of that while hearing voices that weren't real, while feeling disconnected from your own body, while carrying genetic predisposition to severe mental illness. She described Carly's father's schizophrenia, the documented history of psychiatric treatment, the recent medication change. She painted a picture of a child in crisis, someone whose brain chemistry had betrayed her, someone who desperately needed help but instead committed an act she couldn't fully comprehend. The attorney's eyes welled with tears as she described the tragedy of this case. 2 families destroyed, a mother dead, a child's life effectively over. She promised to show that Carly's actions, while horrific, resulted from illness rather than malice. The prosecution called their first witnesses, establishing the basic facts of the case. Police officers who responded to the scene testified about what they found: Ashley's body, Heath's injuries, the recovered weapon. Crime scene technicians walked the jury through photographs that showed blood spatter, bullet trajectories, and the layout of the house. These images were difficult to view, several jurors visibly uncomfortable as they examined the evidence. The prosecution methodically built their foundation, each witness adding another layer to the narrative of intentional violence. Forensic experts testified about the timing of the shots, the sequence of events, the physical impossibility of some of the defense's later claims. Every piece of testimony reinforced the prosecution's theme. This was deliberate, calculated, and conscious. Then came the security footage. The courtroom fell silent as monitors displayed the video from inside the Smiley home. Jurors watched Carly moving through familiar spaces with purpose. They saw her retrieve the gun without hesitation. They watched Ashley arrive home, the brief interaction between mother and daughter, Ashley walking toward her bedroom. The audio captured the shots, multiple reports that echoed through the courtroom speakers. Some jurors flinched. Others closed their eyes briefly before forcing themselves to continue watching. The footage showed Carly's movements after the shooting, the repositioning of Ashley's body, the covering with a towel. It showed her using Ashley's phone, typing out the message to Heath. The video was devastating to the defense's narrative of complete dissociation. Every movement appeared purposeful, controlled, aware. The prosecution played the 911 call next. Heath's voice filled the courtroom, ragged with pain and shock. He could barely form complete sentences, his breath coming in gasps as he tried to explain what happened. He said Carly's name with a mixture of disbelief and terror, as if speaking it aloud made the nightmare real. He begged the dispatcher to send help quickly, his voice breaking as he mentioned Ashley, saying he thought she might be hurt too, but he couldn't get to her. The call lasted several minutes, during which Heath's desperation became increasingly palpable. When it ended, the courtroom remained quiet for a long moment. Several jurors wiped their eyes. Carly sat with her head down, her shoulders shaking slightly. Whether she was crying from remorse or from hearing Heath's suffering was impossible to determine. The prosecution's psychiatric expert took the stand, a professional with decades of experience evaluating criminal defendants. She had reviewed all of Carly's medical records, conducted her own evaluation, and examined the evidence from the case. Her testimony was clinical but accessible. Yes, Carly had mental health issues. Yes, she had experienced symptoms of depression, anxiety, and possibly early psychosis, but none of that met the legal standard for insanity. Carly knew the difference between right and wrong. She understood that taking a gun and shooting someone would cause death. She took steps to hide her actions and manipulate the situation, demonstrating consciousness of guilt. The expert explained that dissociation exists on a spectrum, and that even someone experiencing dissociative symptoms can still exercise judgment and control. The jury listened intently, several taking notes as the expert spoke. Cross-examination was aggressive. The defense attorney challenged the expert's conclusions, pointing out that she had spent only a few hours with Carly, while doctors who had treated her for years documented severe symptoms. She questioned whether a brief evaluation could truly capture the depth of Carly's mental state during the crime. She brought up the medication change, asking whether the expert had adequately considered the potential effects of transitioning from Zoloft to Lexapro in an adolescent already experiencing psychotic symptoms. The expert held her ground, reiterating that legal insanity requires complete incapacity, not just impaired judgment. The exchange was tense, both attorneys skilled at their craft, each fighting for dramatically different outcomes. The jury watched this professional combat, knowing that somewhere in the competing narratives lay the truth they needed to find. As the prosecution's case continued, the emotional weight became increasingly heavy. Teachers testified about Carly's academic abilities, her intelligence, her capacity for understanding complex concepts. Friends testified about conversations in the days surrounding the crime, describing Carly as upset but coherent, troubled but functional. The medical examiner provided technical testimony about Ashley's injuries, using clinical language that couldn't quite mask the horror of what the wounds represented. Each witness added another piece to the prosecution's mosaic, a picture of a teenager who had committed violence while fully aware of what she was doing. The defense would have their turn to present a counter-narrative, but the foundation had been laid, and it was devastatingly solid. Heath Smiley's testimony was the moment everyone had been waiting for. He walked to the witness stand slowly, his movements still affected by the injuries he'd sustained. He was sworn in, his hand steady on the Bible despite the visible tension in his face. The prosecutor approached gently, aware that this testimony would be painful for Heath and powerful for the jury. She began with background questions, establishing Heath's relationship with Ashley, his marriage, his role as Carly's stepfather. Heath's voice was soft but clear as he described falling in love with Ashley, how her dedication to Carly had been one of the things that attracted him most. He spoke about trying to build trust with his stepdaughter, the early successes, the gradual connection they'd formed. His eyes remained fixed on the prosecutor, deliberately avoiding looking at Carly. Then they moved to March 19th. Heath described his workday, receiving the text message he believed was from Ashley, his decision to head home earlier than planned. He described pulling into the driveway with no sense of impending danger, entering the house expecting normalcy. His voice tightened as he recalled calling out for Ashley, seeing Carly in the hallway. He demonstrated how she'd held the gun behind her back, how he hadn't noticed it initially. Then the sound of gunfire, the impact of bullets entering his body, the confusion and disbelief that someone was shooting him, that the shooter was Carly. He described the struggle, managing to disarm her despite his injuries, watching her flee. His voice broke as he described crawling toward the bedroom, seeing Ashley's body, realizing she was gone. The courtroom was completely silent except for Heath's testimony. Several jurors had tears streaming down their faces. Even the judge appeared moved, though her expression remained professionally neutral. Heath described the months since, the surgeries, the physical therapy, the nightmares that jolted him awake. He talked about losing Ashley, the love of his life, and in the same moment losing the stepdaughter he'd tried so hard to care for. The dual grief was incomprehensible, he said, mourning his wife while grappling with the fact that her daughter had killed her, recovering from his own gunshot wounds while testifying about who inflicted them. The psychological toll had been as devastating as the physical injuries. He had lost his sense of safety, his ability to trust, his vision of a future he'd been building with Ashley. The defense attorney approached cross-examination carefully, aware that attacking Heath too aggressively would alienate the jury. She focused instead on Carly's behavior in the months before the crime. Had Heath noticed the severity of her mental health struggles? Had he been aware of the self-harm? Did he know about the medication changes? Heath acknowledged that he'd seen warning signs, but admitted he hadn't fully grasped how serious things had become. The defense attorney suggested that perhaps no one had, that Carly's illness had been progressing in ways that weren't visible until it was too late. Heath agreed that mental health issues were complicated, but his tone made clear he didn't believe illness excused what happened. The defense didn't push further, knowing that prolonging Heath's testimony would only deepen the jury's sympathy for him. The prosecution rested their case after Heath's testimony, the strategic placement ensuring the jury's last impression before the defense began would be the surviving victim's pain. Now it was the defense's turn to present their narrative. They called Carly's therapist, who testified about years of treatment, escalating symptoms, and genuine psychiatric distress. The therapist described Carly's reports of hearing voices, feeling disconnected from reality, experiencing intrusive thoughts she couldn't control. These weren't fabrications created after the crime, the therapist emphasized. They were documented in session notes from months and years before. The jury listened, some seeming receptive to this new perspective, others appearing skeptical that symptoms documented in therapy sessions proved anything about Carly's state of mind during the actual crime. The defense's psychiatric expert provided a counter-narrative to the prosecution's expert. This professional had spent significantly more time with Carly, conducting extensive interviews and psychological testing. She testified that Carly met diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder with psychotic features. The voices Carly described were consistent with auditory hallucinations, a symptom of psychosis that can impair someone's connection to reality. The medication change from Zoloft to Lexapro, she argued, could have triggered a severe psychiatric episode, particularly in an adolescent with genetic vulnerability. She walked the jury through research on adolescent brain development, explaining that the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for judgment and impulse control, doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. Carly's brain was still developing, making her more susceptible to psychiatric crises and less capable of rational decision-making. But under cross-examination, even the defense's expert had to acknowledge difficult truths. Yes, Carly had been mentally ill. Yes, she had experienced psychotic symptoms. But did those symptoms completely eliminate her ability to know right from wrong at the moment of the crime? The expert hedged, explaining that mental states exist on a continuum, that someone can be impaired without being completely incapacitated. The prosecutor pressed harder. Did Carly know that shooting her mother would cause death? After a long pause, the expert admitted that Carly likely had that basic understanding. Did Carly take steps to hide what she'd done? Another pause. Yes, she had. The expert tried to explain that dissociation could account for these seemingly contradictory behaviors, but the explanation felt complex and academic compared to the stark clarity of the security footage. Carly's friends testified for the defense, describing her as sensitive, creative, and increasingly troubled in the months before the crime. They spoke about conversations where Carly mentioned feeling like she was watching herself from outside her body, like reality didn't feel real anymore. One friend tearfully recounted a discussion where Carly had said she sometimes didn't recognize herself in the mirror, that the person looking back seemed like a stranger. These testimonies humanized Carly, reminding the jury that she was a real teenager with friends who cared about her, not just a defendant in a murder trial. But the prosecution's cross-examinations were brief and pointed. Had Carly seemed completely out of touch with reality? No. Had she functioned normally in school? Mostly, yes. Had any of them feared she might hurt someone? The answer was always no. The defense considered whether to have Carly testify. It was a high-risk decision. Her testimony could humanize her further, allowing the jury to see her as a frightened child rather than a cold defendant. But it would also subject her to aggressive cross-examination where every inconsistency in her story would be exploited. The prosecution would ask her to explain the security footage, the text message, the calculated actions that seemed incompatible with complete dissociation. After lengthy discussions, the defense decided against it. The risk was too great. Carly's youth and vulnerability were apparent without testimony. Putting her on the stand might do more harm than good. They would rest their case on expert testimony, medical records, and the argument that mental illness explained everything, even if it didn't excuse it in the strict legal sense. Closing arguments approached, both sides preparing to synthesize weeks of testimony into final narratives that would guide the jury's deliberations. The defense would argue for mercy, for recognition that a sick child deserved treatment rather than punishment. The prosecution would argue for justice, for acknowledgement that victims' lives mattered more than a defendant's excuses. And 12 jurors would be asked to answer a question with profound implications. When does mental illness absolve responsibility, and when does it simply explain without excusing? The answer would determine whether Carly spent her life in prison or received some possibility of eventual freedom. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of someone who genuinely believed in the righteousness of their cause. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury, making eye contact with each member as he began to speak. He reminded them of why they were there. Ashley Smiley was dead. Heath Smiley had barely survived. A family had been destroyed. Those were facts, he said, that no amount of psychiatric testimony could change or diminish. He acknowledged that Carly had struggled with mental health issues. He didn't dispute the diagnosis or minimize her suffering. But suffering, he argued, was not the same as legal insanity. Millions of people battle depression, anxiety, even psychotic symptoms, without ever harming another person. Mental illness might explain behavior, but it didn't excuse violence or eliminate accountability. He walked the jury through the evidence methodically. The security footage showed deliberate action, not confused wandering. Carly knew where the gun was located. She retrieved it with purpose. She waited for her mother to come home. After the shooting, she didn't call for help or show signs of panic. Instead, she covered the wounds, sent a deceptive text message, and lured Heath into the house. These were the actions of someone who understood what she'd done and was trying to manipulate the aftermath. The prosecutor's voice rose as he emphasized this point. Consciousness of guilt, he said, was evident in every action Carly took after pulling the trigger. Someone in the grip of a complete psychotic break wouldn't have the presence of mind to send a text message impersonating their victim. They wouldn't reposition a body or cover wounds. They would be lost in delusion, unable to navigate reality in any functional way. He addressed the medication change directly, knowing the defense had emphasized it repeatedly. Yes, switching psychiatric medications carried risks. Yes, the transition could be destabilizing. But nothing in Carly's behavior that day suggested she was in the throes of a psychiatric emergency. She attended school. She completed assignments. She conversed with friends. She moved through her day with apparent normalcy until she made a choice. A terrible, irreversible choice. The prosecutor reminded the jury that choice was the key word here. Carly chose to take the gun. She chose to wait for her mother. She chose to fire multiple times. She chose to text Heath. Each decision point represented an opportunity to stop, to reconsider, to choose differently. Mental illness might have influenced those choices, but it didn't eliminate her agency entirely. His voice softened as he spoke about Ashley. He showed the jury photographs of her smiling, teaching, living the life that was stolen from her. He talked about the students who had lost a beloved teacher, the family who had lost a daughter and sister, Heath, who had lost his wife and nearly his own life. Justice for Ashley meant acknowledging that her death wasn't an unfortunate accident or the inevitable result of uncontrollable illness. It was caused by deliberate violence. The prosecutor's final words were simple and direct. Carly Gregg was guilty of first-degree murder. She was guilty of attempted murder. She was guilty of tampering with evidence. The jury's duty was to recognize those truths and deliver a verdict that honored Ashley's memory and validated Heath's suffering. The defense's closing argument took a fundamentally different approach. Carly's lead attorney stood before the jury and asked them to imagine being 14 years old. "Really imagine it," she said. "The confusion, the emotional intensity, the feeling that everything happening to you was the most important thing in the world. Now imagine experiencing all of that while your brain chemistry was fundamentally broken, while voices whispered commands you couldn't silence, while reality itself felt unstable and untrustworthy." She spoke slowly, making sure every word landed. Carly didn't choose to be mentally ill. She didn't choose to inherit genetic vulnerability from her father. She didn't choose the psychiatric symptoms that had been documented for years before this tragedy occurred. The attorney addressed the security footage directly, knowing it was the prosecution's strongest evidence. Yes, Carly's movements appeared deliberate. But dissociation, she explained, could create a state where someone goes through motions without true conscious awareness. Think of it like sleepwalking, she suggested. Someone in that state can navigate their environment, can perform complex actions, but they're not fully present. They're not making conscious choices in the way we typically understand choice. Carly's journal entries described feeling like a passenger in her own body, watching herself do things without feeling in control. That wasn't a story invented after the fact to avoid responsibility. It was documented before the crime, evidence of genuine psychiatric distress that ultimately manifested in the most tragic way possible. She talked about the medication change, bringing up research studies about the risks of transitioning psychiatric medications in adolescence. The defense attorney's voice carried urgency as she described how this change occurred just days before the shooting, during a period when Carly should have been monitored most carefully. Instead, she was sent home with a new prescription and inadequate supervision during a vulnerable window. The attorney wasn't blaming the doctors or Ashley or anyone specifically. She was simply pointing out that this was a perfect storm of factors: genetic predisposition, documented psychotic symptoms, medication transition, adolescent brain development. Any one of these might have been manageable. Together, they created a situation where tragedy became almost inevitable. The attorney's closing focused heavily on Carly's youth, 15 years old at sentencing, still a child by any reasonable measure, still developing, still capable of change, still deserving of hope for eventual rehabilitation. She reminded the jury that the question before them wasn't whether what happened was terrible. Everyone agreed it was. The question was whether holding a mentally ill child criminally responsible in adult court served any purpose beyond vengeance. Would society be safer with Carly locked away forever? Or would everyone be better served by a verdict that acknowledged her illness and provided opportunity for treatment and eventual healing? The attorney's eyes filled with tears as she described visiting Carly in detention, seeing a frightened child who could barely comprehend the magnitude of what her illness had caused. Her final argument addressed legal insanity directly. She acknowledged that Carly didn't meet the strictest definition, complete inability to distinguish right from wrong. But she urged the jury to consider a broader understanding of culpability. Yes, Carly had some awareness that her actions were wrong, but that awareness was filtered through a profoundly disordered mind, through hallucinations and dissociation that distorted her connection to reality. Should we hold someone fully accountable when their brain was fundamentally compromised? Should we treat a mentally ill 14-year-old the same way we'd treat a calculating adult offender? The attorney's voice broke as she made her final plea. This case was a tragedy for everyone involved. Ashley was gone. Heath was traumatized. And Carly's life was effectively over unless the jury chose mercy. She asked them to find room for compassion, for recognition that mental illness mattered, for hope that even in the darkest circumstances, redemption remained possible. The jury received their instructions from the judge, detailed legal guidelines about how to evaluate the evidence and apply the law. They were told to consider each charge separately, to weigh the testimony of experts carefully, to distinguish between sympathy and legal standards. The judge explained the definition of first-degree murder, the requirements for attempted murder, the elements of tampering with evidence. She reminded them that reasonable doubt meant exactly that. Doubt based on reason, not mere possibility or speculation. The jury's job was to determine guilt or innocence based on evidence, not emotion. With those instructions, they filed out of the courtroom to begin deliberations, carrying with them the weight of a decision that would affect multiple lives forever. The jury deliberated for just over 5 hours. In cases this complex, with weeks of testimony and competing expert witnesses, such a relatively brief deliberation suggested strong consensus. Legal analysts watching the case speculated about what the short time frame meant. Some thought it indicated the prosecution's evidence had been overwhelming, leaving little room for doubt. Others wondered if the jury had simply found the defense's mental health arguments insufficient to overcome the stark reality of the security footage. Inside the deliberation room, 12 people wrestled with questions that had no perfect answers. They reviewed exhibits, replayed portions of testimony in their minds, and debated the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility. When they finally reached unanimous agreement, they notified the bailiff. The verdict was ready. The courtroom filled quickly once word spread that a decision had been reached. Journalists rushed to claim seats. Ashley's family members arrived holding hands and bracing themselves for whatever came next. Heath sat in the front row, his face expressionless, his body rigid with tension. Carly was brought in from a holding area, flanked by her defense attorneys who had spent the waiting hours preparing her for both possible outcomes. She looked smaller than ever, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she took her seat. The judge entered, calling the court to order, and asked the jury foreman if they had reached a verdict. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper that contained words powerful enough to determine the rest of Carly's life. Guilty. First-degree murder. The word hung in the air for a moment before its full weight descended on everyone present. Carly's shoulders shook as she began to cry, the sound muffled but audible in the silent courtroom. Her attorneys placed comforting hands on her arms, their faces showing disappointment but not surprise. The foreman continued, guilty of attempted murder, guilty of tampering with evidence. 3 guilty verdicts, a complete rejection of the insanity defense, and the broader argument that mental illness should mitigate her responsibility. The jury had heard all the psychiatric testimony, reviewed all the evidence of Carly's struggles, and concluded that none of it was sufficient to excuse or even significantly diminish her culpability. Ashley's family members embraced, some crying with relief, others simply sitting in stunned silence as the reality settled in. Heath's reaction was complex and difficult to read. There was no triumph in his expression, no sense of satisfaction. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the verdict, but his eyes remained sad. This wasn't the outcome he'd hoped for when he married Ashley and became part of Carly's life. He'd wanted to help raise her, to be a positive presence, to contribute to a happy family. Instead, he was sitting in a courtroom watching his stepdaughter be convicted of murdering his wife and trying to murder him. The verdict brought a form of justice, but it couldn't restore what had been lost. Ashley was still gone. The family they'd been building together was still destroyed. Justice and healing, Heath was learning, were not the same thing. The judge scheduled sentencing for several weeks later, giving the defense time to prepare mitigation arguments and the prosecution time to prepare victim impact statements. In the interim, Carly returned to detention, now convicted but not yet sentenced. The difference was profound. Before the verdict, there had been at least theoretical hope for acquittal or a lesser conviction. Now, there was only certainty. She was a murderer in the eyes of the law. The only remaining question was how long she would spend in prison. For first-degree murder committed as a juvenile, Mississippi law prohibited the death penalty but allowed for life without parole. The judge had discretion within those bounds, influenced by aggravating and mitigating factors, by victim impact testimony, by the defendant's age and circumstances. News of the verdict spread rapidly. Social media erupted with commentary, people who had followed the case expressing opinions about whether justice had been served. Some celebrated the guilty verdict, arguing that mental illness couldn't be allowed to excuse murder, that victims deserved accountability regardless of the offender's age or psychiatric history. Others expressed sadness that a mentally ill child would spend her life in prison, arguing that the verdict represented a failure of society to adequately address juvenile mental health issues before they escalated to tragedy. The debate revealed deep divisions in how people understood crime, punishment, illness, and responsibility. There were no easy answers, only strongly held beliefs that often contradicted each other. Mental health advocates used the case to highlight systemic failures. They pointed to inadequate mental health services for adolescents, to the difficulties families face in accessing treatment, to the gaps between recognizing psychiatric symptoms and getting effective intervention. Carly had been in therapy. She'd been prescribed medication. Her symptoms had been documented, yet the system hadn't prevented tragedy. What did that say about how society approaches juvenile mental health? What changes were needed to ensure other families didn't experience similar devastation? These questions generated discussion in professional circles and legislative chambers, though meaningful reform remained frustratingly elusive. It was easier to debate theoretical solutions than to fund and implement practical programs. Victim advocacy groups emphasized Ashley's life and Heath's suffering, pushing back against narratives that seemed to minimize the crime in favor of focusing on Carly's mental health. Ashley had been a dedicated teacher and mother, someone who had devoted herself to helping others. She deserved to be remembered as more than just a victim in a case study about mental illness and criminal justice. Her death mattered. Her loss left a permanent hole in her family, her classroom, her community. Heath's trauma was ongoing, manifesting in physical pain, nightmares, and the psychological burden of surviving, while Ashley hadn't. Their experiences couldn't be reduced to footnotes in a larger policy debate. They were real people whose lives had been shattered by violence, regardless of the perpetrator's psychiatric history. The weeks between verdict and sentencing felt interminable for everyone involved. Carly's defense team prepared documents detailing every possible mitigating factor: her age, her mental health history, her lack of prior criminal record, her potential for rehabilitation if given treatment. They gathered letters from teachers, friends, and mental health professionals who believed Carly could change, could grow, could eventually become someone other than the person who committed these crimes. They researched similar cases, looking for precedents that might persuade the judge toward mercy. Their goal was life with the possibility of parole rather than life without, a distinction that meant everything to their client. The prosecution prepared victim impact statements, giving Ashley's family and Heath opportunities to address the court about how the crime had affected them. These statements would be emotionally devastating, describing grief that couldn't be adequately expressed in words, trauma that permeated every aspect of daily life, loss that would never fully heal. The prosecution also prepared arguments for the maximum sentence, emphasizing the brutality of the crime, the vulnerability of the victims, the calculated nature of certain actions. They would argue that Carly's youth, while a factor to consider, shouldn't outweigh the severity of what she'd done. Some crimes, they contended, demanded the harshest possible consequences regardless of the offender's age. The sentencing hearing arrived on a gray morning that seemed to match the somber mood inside the courtroom. This would be the final chapter in the legal proceedings, the moment when theoretical punishment became concrete reality. Carly was brought in wearing the same simple clothing her defense team had selected for trial, an attempt to emphasize her youth even as the court prepared to impose an adult sentence. She looked thinner than she had during the trial, the stress of the conviction and the waiting period having taken a visible toll. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture defeated. She knew what was likely coming. Her attorneys had been honest about the probable outcome, preparing her as best they could for the words that would seal her fate. The judge began by summarizing the case, reviewing the charges and the jury's verdicts. Her tone was measured, professional, but not without compassion. She acknowledged that this was an extraordinarily difficult case, one that involved competing values and interests that couldn't be perfectly reconciled. Then, she invited victim impact statements, the opportunity for Ashley's family and Heath to speak directly about how the crime had affected them. Ashley's mother approached first, moving slowly to the podium, her hands gripping a sheet of paper covered in handwritten notes. Her voice shook as she began to speak, describing her daughter as a light in the world, someone whose kindness and dedication had touched countless lives. She talked about never getting to see Ashley grow old, never having grandchildren from her, never sharing another holiday or birthday or ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Ashley's mother spoke about the phone call that shattered her world, the moment she learned her daughter was gone. She described the funeral, looking at Ashley in the casket and struggling to accept that this vibrant person had been reduced to a body in a box. She talked about the nightmares, the moments of forgetting where she'd reach for her phone to call Ashley before remembering. The grief, she said, was a physical weight she carried every moment of every day. Her voice hardened as she looked toward Carly for the first time. She said she'd tried to find compassion, tried to remember that Carly was just a child, but all she could see was the person who had stolen her daughter. She asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence, to ensure that Carly never walked free, to provide at least that small measure of justice for Ashley. Heath's statement was next. He stood at the podium for a long moment before speaking, gathering himself for what he needed to say. His voice was quiet but steady as he described the life he'd built with Ashley, the plans they'd made, the future they'd envisioned together. All of it gone in an afternoon of violence. He described his physical recovery, the surgeries and therapy, the scars that would mark his body forever. But the psychological wounds, he said, were deeper and more persistent. He had nightmares about that day, about the sound of gunfire, about seeing Ashley's body. He flinched at loud noises. He struggled to trust anyone. The simple act of coming home to an empty house triggered panic attacks because the last time he'd come home expecting normalcy, he'd been shot. Heath's testimony became more complicated as he addressed Carly directly. He'd loved her once, he said. He'd tried to be a good stepfather, had genuinely cared about her well-being. That made the betrayal somehow worse. She hadn't just killed his wife and tried to kill him. She'd destroyed the trust at the foundation of their family. He paused, his voice breaking slightly, before saying that he didn't know if he wanted maximum punishment or if some part of him still hoped for redemption. He was torn between grief and memory, between the monster Carly had become and the child she'd once been. Ultimately, he said, he would trust the judge to decide what justice required. He simply wanted acknowledgement that his suffering mattered, that Ashley's death mattered, that their lives had value beyond being footnotes in a story about mental illness. The defense presented their mitigation case, calling witnesses who spoke about Carly's potential for rehabilitation. A psychiatrist testified about adolescent brain development, emphasizing that Carly's brain was still forming, still capable of significant change. With proper treatment, intensive therapy, and time to mature, she could potentially become someone very different from the troubled teenager who committed these crimes. The psychiatrist acknowledged that the harm couldn't be undone, but argued that destroying a child's entire future served no constructive purpose. Treatment, not warehousing in adult prison, offered at least some possibility of eventual healing and contribution to society. The testimony was earnest and backed by research, but it felt almost academic against the raw emotion of the victim impact statements. Carly's defense attorney made an impassioned plea for mercy. She reminded the judge that Carly was 15 years old, that her brain was still developing, that sentencing her to die in prison meant giving up on the possibility of change. She emphasized the mental health history, the genetic vulnerability, the medication issues that had contributed to the tragedy. She acknowledged that nothing could bring Ashley back or fully heal Heath's wounds, but argued that extreme punishment wouldn't accomplish those goals either. She urged the judge to impose a sentence that preserved at least theoretical hope for eventual parole, decades in the future after Carly had received treatment and demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. It was a sentence that acknowledged both the severity of the crime and the defendant's youth and capacity for change. The prosecution's response was firm and uncompromising. They argued that some crimes were so heinous that age became almost irrelevant. Carly had murdered her mother in cold blood. She had ambushed and tried to murder her stepfather. She had manipulated evidence and shown calculated deception in the aftermath. While mental illness and youth were factors to consider, they couldn't erase the enormity of what had been done. The prosecutor reminded the judge of Ashley, who would never have another birthday, never teach another class, never hold grandchildren. Heath would carry physical and psychological scars forever. Justice for them required a sentence that reflected the value of their lives and the severity of the harm inflicted upon them. The prosecution asked for life without parole on the murder charge, with additional time for the other convictions to run consecutively. The judge asked if Carly wished to make a statement. After a whispered consultation with her attorneys, Carly stood. She was barely visible behind the podium, her small stature emphasized by the formal courtroom setting. Her voice was barely audible as she began to speak. She said she was sorry. The words came out haltingly, interrupted by tears. She said she thought about her mother every day, that she wished she could take everything back, that she didn't fully understand why it happened. She mentioned the voices, the feeling of not being in control, the confusion that still plagued her when she tried to remember that day. She apologized to Heath, to her grandparents, to everyone affected by what she'd done. Her statement was brief and repetitive, the words of someone struggling to articulate something beyond her emotional and verbal capacity. The judge took a brief recess to consider the sentencing decision, though most observers believed she'd already made up her mind based on the evidence and arguments presented. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. The judge began by acknowledging the complexity of the case, the genuine tragedy that had affected multiple families, the difficult balance between justice and mercy. She noted Carly's age and mental health history, factors that carried significant weight. But she also noted the brutality of the crime, the vulnerability of the victims, the calculated actions that suggested preserved judgment. After considering all factors, she announced her decision. For the first-degree murder of Ashley Smiley, Carly Madison Gregg would serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words landed like a physical blow. Life without parole. Carly would never leave prison. She would age from 15 to 75 behind bars, assuming she lived that long. She would never attend college, never have a career, never fall in love, or start a family. Every milestone of adult life that most teenagers took for granted was now permanently out of reach. Carly collapsed forward, her face hitting the table as sobs racked her body. Her attorneys moved to comfort her, but there was little they could offer beyond physical presence. The sentence was final, the harshest possible punishment available under law. The judge continued, adding a life sentence for attempted murder to run concurrently, meaning it wouldn't add additional time but emphasized the separate nature of the crime against Heath. The tampering charge received additional years, though they were essentially meaningless given the life sentence already imposed. The courtroom erupted in muted reactions. Ashley's family members embraced, some crying with relief that maximum justice had been delivered. Others sat stone-faced, their expressions suggesting that no sentence could truly satisfy the loss they'd experienced. Heath's reaction was more ambiguous. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the sentence, but his eyes showed no triumph. There was only sadness, a deep weariness that came from months of trauma, testimony, and reliving the worst day of his life. This was the end of the legal process, but not the end of his suffering. The sentence meant Carly would be held accountable, but it didn't restore anything that had been taken. Justice had been served according to the law, yet the hollow feeling in his chest remained unchanged. Carly was eventually helped to her feet by bailiffs who showed surprising gentleness despite the gravity of her crimes. She was led out of the courtroom through a side door, headed back to detention, and eventually to adult prison. At 18, she would be transferred from the juvenile facility to a women's correctional institution where she would spend the remainder of her life. The defense attorneys gathered their materials slowly, their faces showing the exhaustion that came from fighting a losing battle they'd known was likely lost from the beginning. They would file appeals, but everyone understood the chances of success were minimal. Appellate courts rarely overturned sentences that fell within legal guidelines, and the judge had followed all proper procedures in reaching her decision. Outside the courthouse, media crews surrounded the various parties as they emerged. The prosecution held a brief press conference, emphasizing that justice had been served for Ashley Smiley and her family. They acknowledged the tragedy of the situation, the fact that multiple lives had been destroyed, but maintained that accountability remained essential regardless of the defendant's age. Mental illness, they reiterated, provided explanation but not excuse. Society couldn't function if psychiatric diagnoses became blanket immunity from consequences. The victims deserved recognition that their lives mattered, that their deaths or suffering wouldn't be minimized by focusing exclusively on the perpetrator's circumstances. The prosecutor's tone was professional but firm, making clear that they believed the sentence was appropriate and just. The defense team also spoke with reporters, though their message was markedly different. They expressed profound disappointment with the sentence, arguing that condemning a mentally ill 15-year-old to die in prison represented a failure of justice and compassion. They announced their intention to appeal, though they acknowledged the challenges ahead. They emphasized that Carly was still a child, that her brain was still developing, that decades from now she would be a completely different person than the troubled teenager who committed these crimes. The possibility of eventual parole, even if decades away, would have provided some hope, some incentive for rehabilitation, some acknowledgement that people could change. Life without parole eliminated all of that, treating a juvenile offender as if they were beyond redemption. The attorney's frustration was evident, though they maintained professional composure. Mental health advocates responded to the sentence with criticism, arguing that it reflected society's failure to adequately address juvenile psychiatric issues. They pointed out that Carly had been in treatment, that her symptoms had been documented, that warning signs had been visible for years. Yet the system hadn't prevented tragedy, and now that same system was imposing the harshest possible punishment. Where was the acknowledgement of collective responsibility? Where was the recognition that better mental health services, more intensive monitoring, and earlier intervention might have prevented this entire tragedy? The sentence, they argued, was easier than examining the structural failures that allowed a mentally ill teenager to access a loaded firearm and descend into violence without adequate intervention. Punishment was straightforward. Prevention required sustained investment and political will that rarely materialized. Victim advocacy groups countered these arguments forcefully. They emphasized that Ashley Smiley's death couldn't be reduced to a case study about inadequate mental health services. She was a real person who had been murdered by someone she loved and trusted. Her family deserved justice, not endless discussions about the perpetrator's psychiatric history. While improving mental health services was important, it couldn't become an excuse for minimizing violent crime. The advocates argued that empathy for offenders shouldn't eclipse empathy for victims, that society needed to maintain clear moral boundaries about unacceptable behavior. The sentence recognized those boundaries, affirming that some acts carried consequences severe enough to outweigh even legitimate mitigating factors like age and mental illness. The debate played out across news programs, editorial pages, and social media platforms. People who had followed the case from the beginning felt vindicated or outraged, depending on their pre-existing beliefs about crime and punishment. Those who believed in harsh accountability saw the sentence as appropriate, even necessary. Those who prioritized rehabilitation and second chances saw it as cruel and counterproductive. Very few people occupied the middle ground, acknowledging the legitimate concerns on both sides without easy answers. The case became a symbol, invoked in broader discussions about how society should handle juvenile offenders, mentally ill defendants, and crimes that challenged simple categories of guilt and innocence. For Carly, the immediate future meant returning to detention while the transfer to adult prison was arranged. She would spend her remaining time in juvenile custody on suicide watch, mental health professionals concerned that the finality of her sentence might trigger a crisis. She met with counselors daily, processing the reality that her life as she'd known it was over. Some days, she seemed to grasp the magnitude of what she faced. Other days, she appeared detached, as if the sentence were happening to someone else. The dissociation that had been part of her defense narrative now manifested as a coping mechanism, her mind protecting itself from the overwhelming truth of life without parole. Her family struggled with their own complicated grief. They mourned Ashley, the daughter and sister who had been taken from them. But they also mourned Carly, the granddaughter and niece who now faced dying in prison. Some family members believed the sentence was just, that Carly needed to be held accountable regardless of their emotional connection to her. Others believed it was excessive, that mental illness should have warranted more lenient treatment. These divisions created fractures within the family, relationships strained by fundamentally different beliefs about justice, mercy, and what they owed to both Ashley's memory and Carly's future. There were no family gatherings that didn't carry the weight of these unresolved tensions, no conversations that didn't eventually circle back to the tragedy that had redefined all their lives. The appeals process began within weeks of sentencing, though everyone involved understood it was largely procedural rather than realistic. Carly's defense team filed motions arguing that the sentence constituted cruel and unusual punishment for a juvenile offender, that the judge had failed to adequately consider mitigating factors, and that certain psychiatric evidence had been improperly excluded during trial. They cited Supreme Court precedents about juvenile sentencing, including cases that had restricted the use of mandatory life without parole for minors. But those precedents applied primarily to mandatory sentencing schemes, and Mississippi's law gave judges discretion rather than requiring automatic life sentences. The judge had exercised that discretion, considered the relevant factors, and chosen the harshest available option. Appellate courts typically deferred to such decisions unless clear legal errors had occurred. The appeals focused heavily on the excluded evidence, psychiatric evaluations, and expert testimony that the defense argued should have been admitted. During trial, the judge had ruled that certain speculative theories about Carly's mental state were inadmissible because they lacked sufficient scientific foundation. The defense contended this ruling had prevented the jury from fully understanding Carly's psychological condition at the time of the crime. The prosecution countered that the excluded evidence was properly rejected as unreliable, that plenty of psychiatric testimony had been admitted, and that the jury had received adequate information to make an informed decision. The appellate court would need to determine whether the trial judge had abused her discretion in making these evidentiary rulings, a high bar that defendants rarely cleared. Months passed as the appeal worked through the system. Carly turned 16 in juvenile detention, the milestone marked only by the knowledge that she was 2 years closer to transfer to adult prison. Birthdays behind bars felt surreal, disconnected from the celebrations she'd once known. There was no party, no presents, no gathering of friends and family. Just another day in a cell, punctuated by meetings with attorneys who explained legal procedures she struggled to understand. Her mental health remained fragile, medications adjusted periodically to manage depression and anxiety that intensified with each passing month. Therapy sessions focused on helping her process her situation, though no amount of counseling could make life without parole feel anything other than devastating. Heath attempted to rebuild his life, though reconstruction proved nearly impossible. He'd moved from the house where Ashley had been murdered, unable to remain in a space so saturated with trauma. He attended grief counseling and support groups for crime victims, finding some comfort in talking with others who understood loss and violation. But healing was non-linear, marked by setbacks and triggers that could emerge from anywhere. A song Ashley had loved, a date on the calendar that marked an anniversary, a student who reminded him of Carly at a younger age. Each trigger sent him spiraling back into the pain, proving that justice and emotional recovery were separate processes that didn't necessarily align. The sentence had provided closure in a legal sense, but the wound remained open, infected, resistant to healing. The appellate court finally issued its decision nearly a year after sentencing. The ruling was brief and decisive. The trial court had not abused its discretion in excluding the disputed psychiatric evidence. The jury had been properly instructed on the legal standards for insanity and culpability. The sentence, while harsh, fell within the range permitted by law and reflected appropriate consideration of both aggravating and mitigating factors. The conviction and sentence were affirmed in their entirety. Carly's attorneys received the decision with resignation rather than surprise. They'd known the odds were against them, that appellate courts rarely reverse trial court decisions absent clear legal errors. They notified Carly of the outcome, watching her crumble as the last thread of hope snapped. The conviction was final. The sentence was final. There would be no retrials, no second chances, no possibility of freedom. The defense team considered further appeals, including a potential petition to the state Supreme Court and eventually federal courts. But each level of appeal became increasingly unlikely to succeed, and the process could drag on for years without meaningful hope of reversal. They explained this to Carly, trying to help her accept reality rather than clinging to false hope. She oscillated between acceptance and denial, some days acknowledging her situation and other days insisting that someone would eventually recognize the injustice and free her. Her attorneys didn't have the heart to completely extinguish that hope, even though they knew it was essentially baseless. Sometimes hope, even unrealistic hope, was all that kept someone from giving up entirely. Carly's 18th birthday approached, the date that would trigger her transfer from juvenile detention to adult prison. The juvenile facility, while restrictive, had been designed with some consideration for developmental needs. There were educational programs, counseling services, activities meant to provide structure and purpose. Adult prison would be harsher, more violent, more dehumanizing. Carly would be among the youngest inmates in a population that included women convicted of every imaginable crime, many serving lengthy sentences that had hardened them in ways Carly couldn't yet comprehend. Her attorneys tried to prepare her, explaining what to expect, how to stay safe, whom to trust, and whom to avoid. But no amount of preparation could fully ready a teenager for life in adult prison. The transfer occurred on a cold morning shortly after her birthday. Carly was processed out of juvenile detention, her meager belongings packed into a single bag. She was transported in a van with barred windows, watching the world pass by, knowing she wouldn't see it again except through prison fencing and during rare supervised excursions. The adult facility loomed in the distance, a sprawling complex of concrete and razor wire that would be her home for the rest of her life. She was processed in through receiving, strip-searched, assigned a number that would identify her more often than her name. She received prison uniforms, bedding, and a list of rules that governed every aspect of her existence. Then she was led to her cell, a small space containing a bunk, toilet, and sink. The door closed behind her with a metallic clang that echoed down the corridor. Life in prison quickly established its own rhythm, monotonous and oppressive. Carly was assigned a cellmate, a woman in her 30s, serving time for armed robbery. The cellmate was neither friendly nor hostile, simply indifferent to this new arrival, who was young enough to be her daughter. Carly learned the unwritten rules of prison survival. Mind your own business, don't show weakness, form strategic alliances, but trust no one completely. She attended mandated classes and therapy sessions, though the resources available in prison were far inferior to what she'd received in juvenile detention. The other inmates were curious about her case, having seen news coverage or heard rumors. Some viewed her with suspicion, uncomfortable with someone who had killed her own mother. Others saw her as vulnerable, someone who could be exploited or protected depending on their inclinations. The years began to pass, each one blurring into the next with little to distinguish them. Carly aged from 18 to 20 to 25, her adolescence and young adulthood consumed by incarceration. She missed every milestone that defined the transition to adulthood for her former peers. While they attended college, started careers, fell in love, and built independent lives, she remained in a cell, her world confined to prison walls and strictly regulated schedules. She maintained sporadic contact with a few family members who hadn't completely severed ties, though visits became less frequent as years passed, and the relationship felt increasingly strained. What was there to talk about? Her life was static, unchanging, offering no updates or developments beyond the mundane details of prison existence. The psychiatric treatment Carly received in prison was inconsistent at best. Budget constraints and limited staff meant that mental health services were stretched thin across a population with significant needs. She met with a counselor periodically, sessions that felt more like check-ins than genuine therapy. Medications were adjusted when symptoms became unmanageable, but the focus was on stability rather than healing. The voices that had once plagued her subsided somewhat, whether due to medication, maturity, or the structured environment of prison was unclear. But depression remained a constant companion, exacerbated by the knowledge that this was her permanent reality. Some days she functioned adequately, attending meals and activities with mechanical compliance. Other days she couldn't leave her bunk, paralyzed by hopelessness that no amount of medication could fully address. Prison politics created additional layers of complexity. Carly learned to navigate the social hierarchies, the alliances and conflicts that could erupt into violence with little warning. She witnessed fights, sometimes brutal ones that left participants injured and sent to segregation. She heard about assaults that occurred in blind spots where cameras couldn't reach. She learned which guards could be trusted and which were indifferent or actively hostile. The experience aged her rapidly, eroding whatever innocence might have remained after her conviction. The frightened teenager who had entered prison gradually transformed into someone harder, more guarded, more adapted to an environment where vulnerability meant danger. It was survival, but it came at the cost of the rehabilitation her defense attorneys had once argued was possible. Outside the prison walls, life continued for everyone else. Heath eventually remarried, finding someone who understood his trauma and accepted the complexity of his past. He remained involved in victim advocacy work, speaking about his experience when invited, though he never sought the spotlight. He rarely thought about Carly anymore, having compartmentalized that part of his life into a sealed box he couldn't afford to open regularly. When he did think about her, the emotions were complicated and contradictory. Anger at what she'd done, sadness for the child she'd been, relief that she was imprisoned and couldn't hurt anyone else, guilt about that relief. None of it resolved cleanly. It simply existed, a permanent tangle he'd learned to live with. Ashley's family maintained a memorial scholarship in her name, awarded annually to a student pursuing education degrees. It was a way of keeping her memory alive, ensuring that her dedication to teaching continued to impact students even after her death. The scholarship recipients never met Ashley, knew her only through stories and the photograph displayed at award ceremonies. But her legacy lived on through them, a small redemption in a story defined by loss. Her mother visited Ashley's grave regularly, maintaining flowers and speaking to the headstone as if her daughter could hear. The grief had evolved from acute agony to chronic ache, manageable but never fully absent. Some wounds, she'd learned, don't heal. They simply become part of who you are, scar tissue that marks where wholeness used to be. The debate about juvenile justice continued in academic and policy circles, with Carly's case frequently cited by both sides. Advocates for reform pointed to her as an example of excessive punishment, arguing that sentencing a mentally ill teenager to die in prison served no constructive purpose. They emphasized brain science, showing that adolescent judgment differs fundamentally from adult reasoning, that young people possess greater capacity for change than older offenders. They pushed for legislation that would make life without parole unavailable for juvenile offenders, requiring sentences that at least allowed for eventual parole consideration. Some states adopted such reforms, though Mississippi was not among them. The political will to appear tough on crime often outweighed evidence-based arguments about juvenile development and rehabilitation. Opponents of reform invoked victims like Ashley, arguing that heinous crimes demanded serious consequences regardless of the offender's age. They contended that reducing sentences for violent juvenile offenders would dishonor victims and send dangerous messages about accountability. The debate often generated more heat than light, with both sides entrenched in positions that reflected deeper values about punishment, mercy, and the purpose of criminal justice. Nuanced discussion was rare, overwhelmed by emotional appeals and political posturing. Meanwhile, people like Carly remained in prison, their lives suspended while society argued about whether they should be there. Carly found some solace in education programs offered within the prison. She completed her GED, having missed traditional high school graduation. She took college courses through a correspondence program, accumulating credits toward a degree she'd never use in the traditional sense, but that provided purpose and intellectual stimulation. She read voraciously, losing herself in books that transported her beyond prison walls. Literature became an escape, a way of experiencing lives and worlds she would never access in person. She wrote occasionally, journal entries that documented her thoughts and emotional state, though these writings remained private, shared with no one. They were honest in ways she couldn't be in therapy sessions or letters to family, raw expressions of rage and despair and occasional glimmers of something like acceptance. As Carly approached her 30s, the reality of life without parole settled into something less acute but more permanent. The early years had been marked by denial and desperate hope for appeal success. Now she understood with crystalline clarity that prison was forever. She would age here, experience middle age, and eventually old age if she lived that long, and ultimately die here. Her body would be released to family or, if no one claimed it, buried in the prison cemetery where unclaimed inmates rested in unmarked graves. The knowledge was devastating in a way that never fully dulled. But humans are remarkably adaptable, capable of adjusting even to circumstances that seem unbearable. Carly found ways to create meaning within severe constraints, relationships with other inmates, small accomplishments in education or work assignments, routines that provided structure and predictability. The question of rehabilitation became increasingly abstract. Was Carly rehabilitated? She'd matured significantly, her 30s bearing little resemblance to the troubled teenager who had committed murder. She understood what she'd done in ways she hadn't at 14, the full weight of taking her mother's life and attempting to take Heath's. She experienced genuine remorse, though whether that remorse would have developed without incarceration was impossible to know. She'd completed extensive therapy, managed her mental health with medication and coping strategies, and demonstrated years of nonviolent behavior in prison. By any reasonable measure, she was no longer the same person. But the sentence wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about punishment, about societal judgment that some acts placed offenders beyond redemption regardless of subsequent change. Whether that judgment was just or simply convenient depended on who you asked. The prison system itself underwent changes during Carly's incarceration, reforms driven by lawsuits over conditions and periodic scandals that attracted media attention. New programs were introduced, focusing on trauma-informed care and mental health services, though implementation remained uneven. Carly participated in some of these programs, finding them more helpful than the minimal services that had existed when she first arrived. Group therapy sessions connected her with other inmates dealing with similar struggles, creating a sense of community that had been absent in her early years. She discovered she wasn't the only person imprisoned for crimes committed during adolescence, that several other women in the facility had been tried as adults for violent offenses committed when their brains were still developing. Their shared experience created bonds, though these relationships existed within the strange context of permanent incarceration. One such friendship developed with a woman named Teresa, who had been sentenced to life without parole at 17 for a crime committed during an abusive relationship. Teresa had spent over 2 decades in prison, aging from teenager to middle-aged woman behind bars. She became something of a mentor to Carly, someone who had navigated the psychological challenges of accepting a permanent sentence and finding ways to maintain humanity despite dehumanizing conditions. Teresa talked about the early years of rage and denial, the gradual transition to acceptance, and the ongoing work of creating purpose when the future held no possibility of freedom. She emphasized that giving up meant dying before your body stopped functioning, that survival required finding meaning even in impossibly constrained circumstances. Carly also participated in a victim impact program, though not involving Ashley's family, who wanted no contact with her. The program brought in speakers who had lost loved ones to violence, who shared their experiences and the ongoing effects of trauma. Listening to these stories forced Carly to confront the human cost of her actions in ways that abstract understanding couldn't capture. She heard about children growing up without parents, about spouses navigating widowhood, about siblings haunted by loss. Each story reflected some aspect of what she'd done to her own family, to Heath, to Ashley's students and friends. The sessions were emotionally brutal, leaving her raw and destabilized for days afterward. But they also felt necessary, a way of ensuring she never minimized or rationalized what she'd taken from the world. By her mid-30s, Carly had been incarcerated for 20 years, more time in prison than she'd spent free. The outside world had changed dramatically during those decades. Technology had evolved in ways that felt almost incomprehensible when described to her. Social movements had shifted cultural conversations about justice, mental health, and accountability. Some of her former classmates had children approaching the age she'd been when she committed murder, a realization that prompted complicated reflections on her own lost potential for family and future generations. She existed in a kind of temporal suspension, aging chronologically while remaining frozen in a moment from her teenage years that defined everything that followed. The few family members who maintained contact noticed changes during their infrequent visits. Carly spoke differently, carried herself differently, seemed more grounded and self-aware than the confused teenager they remembered. Some found this reassuring, evidence that she'd grown and matured despite her circumstances. Others found it troubling, wondering what she might have become if given opportunities for rehabilitation outside prison walls. These visits were often stilted and awkward, conversation limited by the artificiality of the setting and the weight of everything unsaid. What could Carly share about her life that her family could relate to? What could they share about theirs that wouldn't emphasize everything she'd lost? The gulf between their experiences was vast, bridged only by genetic connection and fading memories of who Carly had been before the tragedy. Heath learned of these changes secondhand, through mutual acquaintances and occasional mentions in victim advocacy circles. He felt nothing when he heard that Carly was pursuing education or participating in therapy programs. Good for her, he supposed, though her personal growth couldn't undo what she'd done or mitigate his ongoing pain. He'd moved forward as much as anyone could after such trauma, but forward didn't mean over. Ashley's absence remained a permanent void in his life. The physical scars from his gunshot wounds had faded, but never disappeared. He still had nightmares occasionally, still felt panic in situations that triggered memories of that afternoon. Carly's rehabilitation, if that's what it was, existed in a different universe from his experience as a victim. The two realities rarely intersected, separated by walls both literal and psychological. Periodically, journalists requested interviews with Carly, interested in the long-term effects of juvenile life sentences. She usually declined, uncomfortable with the attention and unsure what purpose her story would serve. Once, she agreed to participate in a documentary about juvenile justice, though she regretted it almost immediately. The filmmakers were respectful, but she felt exploited nonetheless, reduced to a case study and sound bite rather than a full human being. The documentary generated renewed debate when it aired, with some viewers expressing sympathy and others outrage that she'd been given a platform. The attention brought unwanted scrutiny, hate mail that prison staff screened, but that still affected her knowing it existed. She resolved to avoid media requests in the future, preferring obscurity to the complex mix of voyeurism and judgment that public attention brought. The philosophical questions that had defined her trial remained unresolved decades later. Was she more victim or perpetrator? Both, obviously, but in what proportions? And did those proportions matter for questions of justice? Her mental illness had been real, documented, severe. But so was the violence she'd committed, the irreversible harm she'd inflicted on people who had loved her. Could both truths coexist without one diminishing the other? Society seemed unable to hold this complexity, defaulting instead to simplified narratives that cast her as either a monster or a tragic victim of failed systems. The reality, more nuanced and uncomfortable, defied easy categorization. She was a mentally ill child who had committed an adult crime. She was a killer who genuinely hadn't fully understood what she was doing. She was both more and less culpable than her sentence suggested, depending on which lens one used to examine her actions. As Carly entered her late 30s, she began thinking seriously about legacy, about what her life meant in the context of permanent incarceration. She would never have children, never build a career, never contribute to society in traditional ways. But perhaps her story could serve some purpose, could inform debates about juvenile justice or mental health treatment. She began writing more intentionally, documenting her experience not for publication, but for potential future use by researchers or advocates. She wanted people to understand what life without parole actually meant for a juvenile offender, the slow death of hope and possibility, the challenge of maintaining humanity when society had decided you were irredeemable. Whether these writings would ever reach anyone beyond prison walls was uncertain, but the act of creating them provided purpose that daily routine couldn't offer. The years continued their relentless march, and Carly found herself in her 40s, having spent more than half her life behind bars. The prison had become more familiar than any home she'd ever known, its routines more ingrained than childhood memories that grew hazier with each passing year. She could barely remember what freedom felt like, the sensation of making choices about where to go or what to do. Her world had contracted to a series of controlled spaces and scheduled activities, a life measured in counts and meal times and recreational hours. The woman she'd become bore little resemblance to the 14-year-old who had committed murder, yet she remained imprisoned for that teenager's actions, sentenced as if personal. Transformation were impossible or irrelevant. Medical care in prison became increasingly important as she aged. The stress of incarceration took physical tolls that compounded over decades. She developed chronic pain conditions, anxiety that manifested in physical symptoms, and the general deterioration that came from limited movement and institutional food. The prison medical system was adequate for basic needs, but ill-equipped for preventive care or anything beyond minimal treatment. She watched older inmates decline, their health failing in ways that might have been prevented or managed better outside prison. She saw women die in the prison infirmary, their final years marked by suffering that seemed like additional punishment beyond what any judge had imposed. It was a preview of her own eventual fate, a reminder that life without parole meant exactly that, dying in custody, her final breath drawn in captivity. Outside the prison, movements for criminal justice reform gained momentum, driven by research on brain development, racial disparities in sentencing, and recognition that mass incarceration had created more problems than it solved. Several states passed legislation limiting or eliminating life without parole for juvenile offenders, recognizing that adolescent crimes deserved different treatment than adult offenses. Some of these reforms were retroactive, creating pathways for resentencing that offered hope to people who had thought their cases were closed forever. But Mississippi was slow to adopt such changes, its political culture resistant to reforms that could be characterized as soft on crime. Carly watched these developments from behind bars, hope kindling briefly with each legislative proposal before being extinguished when reforms failed or excluded her category of offense. A national organization working on juvenile justice reform took interest in Carly's case, seeing it as emblematic of broader issues they were fighting to address. They reached out to her through attorneys, proposing to make her a test case for legal challenges to juvenile life sentences in Mississippi. The prospect terrified and excited her in equal measure. It meant dredging up everything from the trial, exposing herself to renewed public scrutiny, risking disappointment if the challenge failed. But it also represented possibility, the first genuine hope for freedom she'd felt in decades. After extensive discussions with the legal team and soul-searching about what it would mean to revisit her past so publicly, she agreed to participate. The attorneys began building a case arguing that her sentence violated evolving constitutional standards regarding juvenile punishment. The legal strategy focused on Supreme Court precedents established since Carly's original sentencing. Cases like Miller v. Alabama had ruled that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional, though it left discretionary sentencing intact. Subsequent cases had expanded protections, suggesting that life without parole should be reserved for the rarest juvenile offenders, those incapable of rehabilitation. Carly's attorneys argued that her 20-plus years of incarceration demonstrated rehabilitation, that she was no longer the mentally ill teenager who had committed murder, that her sentence should be reconsidered in light of both legal developments and her personal transformation. They assembled evidence of her educational achievements, therapeutic progress, and decades of disciplinary-free behavior. Expert witnesses prepared testimony about adolescent brain development and the capacity for change even in serious juvenile offenders. The state opposed the motion vigorously, arguing that Carly had received a fair trial and appropriate sentence under law at the time. The fact that some states had changed their approaches to juvenile sentencing didn't mean Mississippi was required to do so, and didn't automatically invalidate sentences imposed under previous standards. Prosecutors reminded the court that Carly had killed her mother and attempted to kill her stepfather in calculated acts that went beyond impulsive teenage behavior. They argued that her current stability was the result of decades of incarceration structure, not evidence she'd be safe outside prison walls. Most importantly, they emphasized that the Supreme Court precedents didn't require resentencing in cases like hers, where the judge had exercised discretion rather than imposing mandatory sentences. The legal fight would be uphill, requiring the court to extend existing protections beyond their current scope. The hearing on the resentencing motion attracted significant media attention, the first time Carly's case had been in the public eye in years. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but journalists filled the gallery, and crowds gathered outside with signs expressing support or opposition. Victim advocacy groups organized to oppose any reduction in Carly's sentence, carrying photographs of Ashley and Heath, reminding anyone who'd listen about the human cost of the crime. Criminal justice reform advocates countered with signs about juvenile justice and second chances, arguing that permanent imprisonment of child offenders served no legitimate purpose. The competing demonstrations reflected society's ongoing inability to reconcile punishment and mercy, accountability and compassion, victims' rights, and offenders' potential for change. Inside the courtroom, Carly sat at the defense table, now a woman in her mid-40s, gray streaking through her hair, her face marked by the passage of decades. She looked nothing like the teenager whose photos had circulated during the original trial. Her attorneys presented their case methodically, calling experts who testified about brain development, rehabilitation, and the fundamental unfairness of sentencing juveniles to die in prison. They showed evidence of Carly's transformation, her education, and therapy and years of law-abiding behavior in prison. They argued that she represented exactly the kind of offender for whom life without parole was inappropriate, someone who had committed a terrible crime as a mentally ill child, but who had grown into a stable adult, no longer dangerous to society. The testimony was compelling, painting a picture of redemption and wasted potential. The prosecution's response emphasized the victims. They called Heath to testify again, now much older himself, to describe the ongoing impact of Carly's crime. His testimony was more measured than it had been at the original trial, time having provided some distance, but the pain remained evident. He described Ashley's absence at family gatherings, holidays marked by empty space at the table, grandchildren she never got to meet. He talked about his own continued struggles, the ways trauma had shaped the decades since the shooting. He said he'd never feel completely safe, never fully trust again. When asked if he believed Carly deserved another chance at freedom, he paused for a long time before answering. He said he didn't know, that part of him wanted to believe in redemption while another part couldn't forget what she'd taken. His ambivalence was honest and perhaps more powerful than outright opposition would have been. The judge took the matter under advisement, promising a decision within several months. Carly returned to prison in a state of suspended hope, unable to fully believe freedom might be possible, but unable to completely dismiss the possibility either. The waiting was excruciating, each day stretching endlessly as she oscillated between imagining life outside prison and bracing for disappointment. She tried to manage her expectations, knowing that the legal barriers were significant and that courts rarely granted such relief. But hope, once kindled, proved difficult to extinguish. She found herself daydreaming about simple freedoms most people took for granted. Walking down a street without guards, choosing what to eat, feeling rain on her face without razor wire above her head. These fantasies felt both precious and dangerous, threatening to make her current existence unbearable if the court ultimately denied her motion. The judge's decision came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, delivered in a written opinion that arrived without ceremony or advance warning. Carly's attorney visited that afternoon, his expression carefully neutral as he was escorted to the meeting room. She knew immediately that the news wasn't what she'd hoped for. Her hands trembled as she listened to him explain. The motion had been denied. The judge acknowledged Carly's rehabilitation and the compelling evidence of her transformation, but concluded that the existing legal precedents didn't require resentencing in her case. Mississippi law had given the original sentencing judge discretion, and that discretion had been exercised within legal bounds, while other states had chosen to reform their juvenile sentencing laws. Mississippi wasn't constitutionally obligated to follow suit. The door that had briefly opened now slammed shut with finality that felt even more devastating than the original sentence. Carly sat in silence for several minutes after her attorney finished speaking. She'd prepared herself for this possibility, had tried to protect her heart from hope's dangerous pull. But the disappointment still cut deep. 25 years of incarceration, decades of growth and change and genuine transformation. And none of it mattered. The law saw only the crime committed by a 14-year-old, not the woman she'd become. Her attorney spoke about further appeals, about continuing to fight, but his words sounded hollow to both of them. They'd exhausted the most promising legal avenues. What remained were long-shot arguments unlikely to succeed, years of additional litigation that would probably end in the same place. Carly thanked him for his efforts, her voice flat, then returned to her cell to process the collapse of hope she'd barely allowed herself to feel. The days following the denial were among the darkest of her incarceration. The brief possibility of freedom had made her current reality unbearable in new ways. She'd allowed herself to imagine a future outside prison walls, and now that future had been definitively erased. Depression descended with crushing weight, heavier than anything she'd experienced in years. She withdrew from activities and relationships, spending long hours lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, contemplating the decade still ahead. Suicide crossed her mind, not for the first time, but with greater urgency than before. What was the point of continuing when nothing would ever change? Why endure another 40 years of this existence when the outcome was already determined? But something kept her from acting on those thoughts. Perhaps it was the relationships she'd built with other inmates, people who depended on her and whom she couldn't abandon. Perhaps it was the faint remaining ember of purpose, the writing she'd been doing, the possibility that her story might somehow help others even if it couldn't help her. Perhaps it was simple biology, the survival instinct that persisted even when rational thought suggested death might be preferable. She didn't know. She only knew that each morning she woke up, got through the day, and eventually slept, then repeated the process the next day. It wasn't living in any meaningful sense. It was enduring, pure and simple, marking time until time ran out. Outside the prison, the decision generated expected reactions. Victim advocacy groups praised it as upholding justice and respecting Ashley's memory. Criminal justice reform advocates criticized it as perpetuating a cruel and counterproductive system that warehoused juvenile offenders rather than recognizing their capacity for change. Neither side had much new to say. The arguments had been rehearsed countless times over the years. The only novel element was Carly herself, now in her mid-40s, a living embodiment of what juvenile life without parole actually meant. Some people who had supported harsh punishment at her original trial found themselves troubled by the image of a middle-aged woman spending the rest of her life imprisoned for something she'd done as a mentally ill child. Others remained unmoved, believing that some crimes permanently forfeited any claim to mercy or redemption. Heath's reaction to the denial was complicated and private. He hadn't advocated publicly for either outcome, uncomfortable with the idea of being cast as either vengeful or forgiving. The truth was, he felt both impulses simultaneously, along with emotions he couldn't easily name. Part of him wanted Carly to remain imprisoned, wanted her to continue paying for what she'd taken from him. Another part recognized that her continued incarceration didn't actually return anything or heal his wounds. Ashley was still gone. He was still traumatized. Carly's location, inside or outside prison, changed none of that. He'd built a life that worked around the void Ashley's death had created, and reopening questions about Carly's punishment disrupted that carefully maintained equilibrium. The denial meant he could continue forward without revisiting those painful questions, at least for now. Years passed slowly, each one indistinguishable from the last in the ways that mattered. Carly aged into her 50s, watching her body betray her in small ways that signaled mortality approaching from the distance. Gray hair became white. Joints ached from decades of limited movement and prison mattresses. Vision deteriorated, requiring glasses that the prison grudgingly provided. She became one of the older inmates, someone younger women approached for advice or perspective, recognizing in her the survivor of decades behind bars. She tried to be helpful, to offer wisdom earned through experience, though she wondered what wisdom she actually possessed beyond endurance. She'd learned to survive incarceration, but survival wasn't the same as flourishing or finding meaning. It was simply not dying, persisting through time because the alternative required more courage than she could muster. The world outside continued its evolution, becoming increasingly foreign to someone whose last direct experience with it had been in her teens. Technology advanced in ways that sounded like science fiction when described by newer inmates. Social norms shifted regarding issues Carly had never engaged with because her development had been frozen at 14. Political landscapes transformed. Elected officials turned over. Crises emerged and resolved without her participation or even full understanding. She existed in parallel to society, aware of its existence but not part of it, watching from behind glass but unable to touch or influence anything beyond prison walls. It was a strange form of death. While still breathing, being present in the world but not of it, marking time without purpose or destination. Ashley's memory lived on in ways Carly would never know about directly. The Scholarship Fund continued supporting education students. Ashley's former students, now adults themselves, occasionally shared memories on social media, expressing gratitude for a teacher who had made a difference in their lives. Her grave was maintained, flowers regularly placed by family members who kept her memory alive through ritual and storytelling. She had become a cautionary tale in discussions about violence and victim rights, her name invoked to support various policy positions she might or might not have agreed with. The person she'd actually been, complex, flawed, fully human, had been simplified into symbol and narrative, her reality obscured by the uses to which her death had been put. As Carly entered her 60s, having spent nearly 50 years incarcerated, the question of meaning became increasingly urgent. What had her life amounted to? She'd committed a terrible crime as a mentally ill child. She'd been punished with the harshest available sentence. She'd transformed herself as much as possible within severe constraints, and none of it mattered in any practical sense. She would die in prison regardless of who she'd become. The system wasn't designed to recognize or reward rehabilitation when the sentence eliminated all possibility of release. She was being punished not for who she was, but for who she'd been half a century earlier, a distinction the law refused to acknowledge. Whether this was just depended on philosophical positions about crime, punishment, and the possibilities of human change, questions far above her pay grade, as another inmate had once joked bitterly. The final years approached with a mix of dread and strange relief. Carly developed health problems that prison medicine could only partially address. Chronic conditions worsened, pain becoming a constant companion. She qualified for medical accommodations, assignments that recognized her limitations, but nothing could change the fundamental reality of her deteriorating body. She thought about death more concretely now, not as abstract future, but as approaching certainty. She'd spent her entire adult life and would spend her elderly years in prison. She would die here, probably in the prison medical unit if she was lucky, alone and unmourned, except by the few people who had maintained contact across the decades. It was the culmination of a sentence imposed when she was barely old enough to understand what life without parole truly meant. The teenage girl who had stood in that courtroom couldn't have comprehended this reality. The elderly woman living it understood perfectly, and understanding changed nothing at all. The story that began with violence in a Brandon, Mississippi home ended not with redemption or reconciliation, but with the slow grinding of institutional machinery reducing a life to its minimum components. Carly Madison. Greg would never leave prison. Ashley Smiley would never return. Heath would carry his trauma to his own grave, and society would continue debating what justice required in cases like this, where mental illness and youth collided with violence and death, creating questions with no satisfactory answers. The only certainty was that punishment had been delivered in full measure, whether or not it had served any purpose beyond itself.